So this is on page 173 if you're following along. So for the roadblocks to forgiving people who have hurt you, the first one that you talk about in the book is chronic shock syndrome. Has anyone ever heard of this before? Chronic shock syndrome. So basically, in order to forgive, the first step is you have to acknowledge how the pain impacted you, how the person hurt you. So a lot of times, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is people will minimize the pain and the level that the pain hurt them. And so with the chronic shock syndrome, this is where you have not acknowledged how the pain has really hurt you. Maybe you minimize it, maybe you say, maybe you don't even realize it. So it could just be like a natural thing that your body does where you're not acknowledging how intensely the pain hurt you. So with the chronic shock syndrome, it's where the emotions get pushed down. And when the emotions are pushed down and you're not able to fully process them, then that is more difficult to truly forgive somebody. So when a traumatic event occurs, what typically happens is your body goes into shock for a few days, a couple weeks, and then after you come out of the shock, then that's when the emotions are able to surface. And in a healthy, not dysfunctional family, that's where you would talk to somebody about it, you'd process through the emotions, you'd process through the event, and then it makes the event less traumatic. However, if it's a dysfunctional family, you probably did not have that luxury to talk about the emotions that surfaced. And so when those emotions surfaced after a few days after or a few weeks after the traumatic event, then your body just pushed them down. And so you never processed those emotions, and then it makes it more difficult to forgive somebody if you haven't actually processed the emotions. So chronic shock syndrome is when the emotions surface a few days after the shock settles in, and then instead of processing them, you push them down. So typically, like I said, if your family wasn't dysfunctional, there would have been, or potentially would have been, a safe space for you to process these. But if you grew up in a dysfunctional family, then you may not have had that safe space. So this is a big part of the healing process, and I know we talk a lot about emotions in this series. If you ever see me for counseling, I'll talk a lot about emotions. Most therapists will. So with emotions and with trauma, the emotions have to be acknowledged and processed before you can work through the trauma. So a lot of people think, oh, well, over time, I'll just ignore and push down these emotions, and over time, the emotions will go away. That is not the case. Research backs it up that that's not the case. You have to process through the emotions. Now, we don't want to re-traumatize you by making you relive the event over and over again, but with trauma-informed CBT and EMDR, the idea is that you identify those emotions and the traumatic event, you process through them in not a re-traumatizing way, but process through them and then move forward with them. So another roadblock is fear. So fear can block forgiveness because, again, you're not acknowledging the emotion of fear. And I was going to bring my emotions pillow, and I just remembered that. So I'll grab it and I'll come and show it to you guys at the end. I even wrote myself a note and I forgot. But I will bring the emotion wheel pillow that I have in my office at the end of group today just to show you guys because it's really cool. One of my clients, actually, a little girl, she came in yesterday and she likes artwork. And so her homework for this week was to do, I think, like 15 minutes of artwork a week. And so she came in and she's like, one of the things I did was draw your emotion wheel pillow. And I was like, oh, that's so great. And I didn't tell her to do that. She did that all on her own. So the emotion wheel pillow is a great tool. So back to fear. With fear, again, it's the emotion. You didn't allow yourself to have the emotions. And so it can come up as fear. So that tends to happen when the person that hurt you is still like lingering somewhere in your body, whether it's physically, you get like a physical reaction when you see the person or hear the person's name. It could just be a thought, an emotion that you have, or it could be, like I said, a physical reaction. So sometimes people are more afraid to face the emotions because they are worried that it will hurt more if they face the emotions. The reality is, while it may hurt initially, the long-term impact of it is going to be reduced if you face the emotions, as opposed to if you just stuff them down. It is actually impacting you and hurting you more in the long term. So I always tell people, you may feel a little worse in counseling before you feel better, but that's because you're acknowledging the emotions, you're acknowledging the events. But then the idea, and again, research backs this up, is that you will start to feel better after that. Whereas if you just keep pushing down these emotions, then it's just going to be throughout your whole life, this lingering kind of either in the background through physical symptoms or through triggers or thoughts, and it just kind of lingers throughout your entire life. So while the reality is you may initially feel worse before you feel better, the idea and the research shows that you will feel better after you address those emotions. So I usually tell people, well, you might hate me the first couple of sessions, but maybe in a month you won't hate coming to counseling anymore. So facing these emotions, especially if they're fear, and it will give you more relief. Because like we've talked about before, any type of trauma or emotions, the more you avoid it, the more power you give it. And so if you don't give it power, then you're kind of cutting off that intensity related to the emotion. The next roadblock is the I had good parents syndrome. So this is kind of where you may be in denial of your childhood. You may be defensive of your parents. Oh, my parents didn't hit me. They just didn't show me love. You may minimize, oh, well, my parent only hit me a couple of times, but this person, she was getting hit every day. And so this is where you kind of get defensive maybe, and you don't want to say anything necessarily negative or think negatively of your parents. So you go to the opposite extreme and you say, oh no, it was fine. It wasn't that bad. So the minimizing part. This can especially happen I've heard a lot of people, especially who are Christians now, and they're saying, well, I want to respect and honor my parents. And so they have a really hard time with that balance of, I want to honor my mother and father, but they also were abusive. So how do I have that balance of, not minimizing it, but also not hating them for it or not holding them accountable for it? So I've heard a lot of people say the minimizing part, like, oh, well, my parents weren't that bad, or they could have been so much worse. But what I usually say to that is, your experience is what happened to you. And so to compare it to somebody else, that's not fair to your emotions and your experience, because what you went through was traumatic and difficult for you. And that's okay, regardless of what the person next to you experienced. And then the last roadblock is good Christians don't get angry. So when people say this, the first thing that I think about is when Jesus got angry and when he flipped over the tables and he was expressing that emotion of anger. Obviously there is emotions underneath the anger, but I always think of that and I think, well, if Jesus, who is perfect, can get angry, then surely it's okay for us to have that emotion. However, it does say, do not let the sun go down when you are angry. So I think that's kind of the follow-up to that, where in the Bible, Jesus specifically says the sun should not go down if you are still angry. So that tells me that holding on to our anger and not addressing that anger, that's where it becomes a problem. So the anger emotion itself is not an issue and not a problem. It's when you're not able to work through that anger. Okay, so one of the other ones that I liked in the book is that when they were talking about the metaphor that they used about a car accident. Did any of you see this one in the book? Okay, I thought this was so cool when they were saying that if you go to somebody who had just been in a car accident and they're clearly unable to get up, they're injured, and you go over to them and you say, I'm calling 911 to get you help, and they say, no, I'm fine, I'll get up in a minute. And he related that to how somebody growing up in a dysfunctional family may respond if somebody comes to them and says, are you okay? Like, do you need help? And their natural response, because they're used to just doing things on their own, not being able to have emotions, is, no, I'm fine. I'll be okay in a minute. And so that is minimizing, again, those emotions. But I thought that was a really cool metaphor. If you think about that, you're like, well, obviously, if somebody is physically injured, they wouldn't turn away help and they wouldn't say, no, I'm fine. But we often do that with our emotions and our emotional health, right? We say, oh, no, I'm fine. I don't need to deal with that. I don't need to worry about that. I'm fine. I'll be fine in a minute. But if you were physically sick or physically injured, then you may be more willing to accept that help. All right. So now we're going to talk about what forgiveness is not. So forgiveness is not just forgetting. I really dislike the phrase that is so common for people to say, forgive and forget, because that's not true. You don't just forget something that happened. You can forgive and still remember what happened and learn from it and use that experience to set boundaries, make sure that you're choosing healthy relationships in the future, but you're not necessarily going to forget what the person did or what happened, and that's okay. You don't need to forget in order to forgive. So when we forgive, that means we remember what I said at the beginning. In order to forgive, you have to process the emotions in order to have true forgiveness. So when we forgive, then we are choosing to focus less on what happened. So oftentimes after events that happen throughout your life, your brain space is consumed by these thoughts. So for example, if you were neglected as a child, your thoughts are consumed by this neglect. And when you forgive, it's releasing that and telling yourself, I don't need to focus on that all the time, and I'm going to focus on something different. So it's freeing up that thoughts and that headspace to be more positive thinking. So this will allow the event to be less in your conscious brain, and so then things aren't going to trigger you as much on a day-to-day if it's not in your conscious brain, and you'll focus on other things that you enjoy. So wouldn't it be so nice to wake up every day and instead of thinking about something that happened, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 20 years ago, to have that mental capacity and that brain power to think about something that you want to think about, something that you're looking forward to, something that you enjoy doing, a hobby. And so with forgiveness, this allows your brain to focus on those positive things that you want to focus on instead of the negative things from the past. So like I said, it doesn't mean that you'll never think of the event again. Even after therapy, you may still think about the event, and that is okay. The idea is that your psychological distress level, what they call it in EMDR is the SUD level, goes from maybe a 10, where when you think about the event, you have a panic attack, you're in psychological distress, you start sweating, you can't deal with thinking about it, to a 0 or 1. So when you think about the event, it's not having that same physical or mental reaction. It's more, yes, that happened. However, it's not causing you to have that severe psychological distress. So I believe that you probably won't ever fully forget about things that have happened in traumatic events, and that's okay. You don't have to do that in order to forgive. So some people will say to me, well, I failed at forgiving. And I say, what do you mean you failed at forgiving? They're like, oh, I still remember what happened. And I say, yeah, of course you're going to remember what happened. It's a big event. If you graduated from high school, you're going to remember that event happened, right? If you get married, you're going to remember that event happened. Good or bad, we remember events that happened. And so you're not a failure at forgiving if you remember the event. It's how it is affecting you. So forgiveness does not necessarily mean the other person was right. And I think this is a hard thing for people, especially who may have experienced abuse, where they feel if they have forgiven or if they forgive the person, they're basically letting the person off the hook. The good news is that's what God's job is. And so as Christians especially, we are able to relieve that pressure of, oh, I have to hold this person accountable, because at the end of the day, at the end of their life, regardless of if they're a Christian or not, they're going to be held accountable by God. And He is going to determine their hearts and if they ask for forgiveness. So that is not something that you have to put on yourself. Because at the end of the day, God's got you, God's got it, and it's added stress to have to put that on yourself, that you have to be the one to hold that person accountable. So He is the final judge. A few weeks ago, Marty was talking about brotherly love and how as Christians, we're supposed to love our brothers and sisters. And I had to listen to this sermon again. I was listening to it the other day while I was walking on the treadmill, and it was, listening to sermons while you're walking on the treadmill is so helpful for me, because sometimes when I'm sitting in church, I'm just sitting there and my mind can get distracted. But when I'm on the treadmill, I'm just thinking, when is this going to end? When can I stop? Is my 40 minutes up yet? And so if I'm having a sermon on in the background, I find it that I get so much more out of it while I'm walking on the treadmill. So as I was listening to his sermon about brotherly love, I was thinking about this in terms of how would this look for somebody who has a traumatic background, and to hear the Bible and Pastor Marty say we are called to love our brothers and sisters in Christ. And I know we've all heard that in the Bible. We've read that. We've heard pastors talk about it. But when you put it in the context of maybe somebody that deeply hurt you, that may be a Christian, Marty was saying that we're still called to love that person. And so how does that look? How do you love somebody who you really don't like? And I know he did talk about, there's some people that you just don't like and that you don't get along with. I mean, we all have different personalities. And so there's a difference between liking and loving. You can set boundaries with somebody and not spend all your time with them, but still have a heart of, I'm going to choose to love them, even though I am not going to spend time with them, or I'm going to set this boundary where I'm not going to, for example, your mom. If your mom is a Christian and deeply hurt you, you can still set that boundary with your mom that you're not going to allow her to talk to you this way, and you're not going to let her do this, and that's okay. It's the loving piece is the heart issue, and I think that's where loving your brother and sisters in Christ and forgiveness kind of go hand in hand, because you can't forgive somebody that you hate, right? You can forgive somebody that you don't like. I've forgiven a lot of people that I don't like, but it's the heart, and it's that at the end of the day, that's what Jesus is looking at, is our hearts. So again, with the forgiveness, it's not letting that person off the hook if you forgive them. And I know it's easy to say that, harder to apply that, but which I feel like I say that every week. I'm like, oh, it's so easy to say, but to actually apply it, I know it's hard, because these people that you are having to forgive or wanting to forgive or being called by God to forgive are people who have deeply hurt you. So it's not an easy thing to forgive them. But it is not letting the person off of the hook, because like I said, at the end of the day, God is the ultimate judge, whether they're a Christian or not a Christian. Forgiveness does not mean that all the pain vanishes instantly. So again, with therapy, you can go into it to expect change. And I've been doing counseling for over almost 6-7 years now. Well, I guess it's been longer than that. Yeah, I feel old now. And I've seen change. I've seen people make huge progress going through therapy and starting out I know I've given you guys examples. I gave probably a few weeks ago with a teenage girl who said, I see a black cloud when I think of my future. You guys remember me talking about that? And then throughout the course of, it was a long process, but she was able to make and see those changes. And so with therapy, it doesn't mean that the pain will go away right away. And it may, like I said before, it may increase before it gets better. But I have seen so many success stories, and if I didn't, I would not keep doing counseling because that would be very discouraging. But I see constant people making progress, and they come in and they are just a hot mess. It is hard for them to come in. I've had people say it's torture coming to see me. And by the end, they're feeling so much better, and that's where the reward, and that's where it's so amazing to see God work throughout the process of them being able to work through their emotions, work through the forgiveness, and then come out on the other side. So I know there's many layers to your past. A lot of people describe it as an onion, and I like that. I like that metaphor. There's different pieces that you have to look at, and then you peel back and you're like, oh, I didn't realize this was affecting me still. And then we work through that, and then we peel back another layer. So we're very unique individuals and very complex individuals. And so as we're working through peeling that onion and looking at those different layers, you're going to see relief. You're going to maybe feel a little lighter. Maybe you'll come in and you feel really heavy and you feel really like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. But each week you might feel a little bit lighter. So especially with I know you're sick of those 4 letters. With EMDR, again, it's the reducing that psychological distress. So even EMDR they're not claiming to say that the event is just you're just going to be able to process it and get over it after one session. That if a therapist tells you that, then run far away, because that is not the case. You're not going to be able to go to one therapy session or one EMDR session and then everything will be better. But it's working on decreasing the pain every time that you come in, every time that you process a different event, process different emotions. So even after you forgive, you still may feel that pain when you think of the person. And that it's okay as long as you're acknowledging that pain is there and working through that. So you may be able to forgive somebody and say, man, I'm still hurt by it, because you're forgiving the person and then you have to process the emotion and the event. So you can forgive the person and still be hurting about what happened, because those are, in my mind, I kind of think of them as 2 different parts of the equation. So there's the event that happened, and there's the person that caused the event or did the event. And so in my mind, I try to break it up into 2, where I can forgive the person for what happened, but I can also feel the pain of what the event caused me, because often the pain causes those negative beliefs. And the event is what caused the negative beliefs. The person didn't cause the negative beliefs. The person caused the event that happened. And then the event caused these negative beliefs that happen throughout your life. So I don't know if that helps, breaking it up like that. That's kind of has helped me in the past to think about it in kind of 2 separate things, so that I'm not feeling like, well, why am I still hurting, even though I really have forgiven the person, but I am still hurting. So one of the other things about the pain vanishing is that often people will say it's easier to just do a quick fix and get rid of the pain. So for example, people will use alcohol, drugs, self-harm, different things to try to kind of get rid of the pain and push that pain down. But really what is happening when you do that is it's kind of like when you were a child growing up in a dysfunctional home. If you're pushing it down, the emotions have to come out somehow. Like a soda bottle, if you shake it up and open it, it's going to come out. It has to come out somehow. So the emotions are going to come out. Whether you like it or not, they're going to come out. So with forgiveness and with acknowledging these emotions, you can be in control of how these emotions come out, as opposed to them coming out through physical health symptoms or mental health symptoms. If you're able to acknowledge the emotions and process the event and work towards true forgiveness, then you're able to basically be in control of how these emotions come out. So I'm going to ask you to look at the finish line. I know this is often hard to do when you are thinking about making peace with your past, but we only have 1 week left. So I want you to look at the finish line. And the finish line doesn't necessarily mean after next week, right? This is a journey, and it most likely will continue the processing after next week. But look at the finish line and try to see yourself on the other side of the finish line. What do you see? Who are you at the other side of the finish line? And if you don't know, which is okay if you don't know, or if it's scary to think about, you're so used to the person that you are right now and the person that you have been. But I want you to think about who you might be. And last week we talked about identity, and this kind of falls into place with that. So who are you at the finish line? Can you see yourself on the other side? Maybe the answer is no right now, but I challenge you to really think about what you want to be after you work through this pain from your past. Who are you on the other side of this? And then lastly, forgiveness does not mean that the other person controls you. So forgiving them doesn't, sometimes people think, oh, I'm losing control if I forgive the person. But forgiveness is not about the other person. The other person never has to know that you forgive them. That is up to you if you would like to. Some people find it therapeutic to tell the person that they forgive them, and that's fine. But forgiveness is not about the other person. You can still forgive the person and have boundaries. Boundaries are a huge thing that you probably will need to have if you're still in contact with the person who hurt you. If it's a parent or a sibling and you don't want to just cut them out of your life, that's okay. But if you forgive them, you do need to still have those boundaries. You don't need to forgive and then say, all right, well, I forgive you. Now I'm just going to give you free rein to treat me however you want. No, you can still forgive and have healthy boundaries. You can still forgive and stand up for yourself. If you have a dysfunctional relationship with your mom and she comes over and criticizes you for your parenting or for your marriage, you can still set those boundaries and not be hateful. You can set boundaries in a loving, healthy way where you have forgiven the person, but you also are setting those boundaries for yourself. So in the book, they talk about forgiveness like a scar. And I also liked this analogy, but you still see the scar after an accident or whatever surgery happens. The scar is still there, and the scar pretty much is always there, whether you like it or not. The scar will stay there. It will fade over time, but you will still see the scar. If you have a scar on your arm or a scar on your leg. My husband has this huge scar on his leg because he fell out of a tree and he broke his entire leg bone. So he has a scar all the way down his leg, and that was when he was a kid, and it's still very prominent. I can still see it. It's probably will not ever fade away to where we won't see it. But with forgiveness, it's the open wound is closed. So that open wound of the first initial cutting your leg open with a stick after falling out of a tree, that open wound heals and it goes to a scar eventually. So with forgiveness, you are healing from the pain. And when you look at the scar, it is once you forgive them, it is not as intense of a pain as that open wound that you initially had when you fell out of that tree. So we talked about what forgiveness is not. So what is forgiveness? Forgiveness means that you are more interested in understanding the dynamics of the offensive events than in blaming somebody for what happened. I'm going to say that again. So forgiveness means you are more interested in understanding the dynamics of the offensive events than in blaming somebody for what happened. So forgiveness does not mean that you can't talk about the event. It doesn't mean that you have to stop trying to put the pieces of the puzzle. I think a common trait for people who grew up in a dysfunctional family is trying to piece that puzzle together, because in your mind you have all these different pieces and the pieces are broken or lost or spread out, and you just say, I want to know what happened. I want to put these pieces back to the puzzle. And with forgiveness, it's okay if you're still thinking about the event and you're still trying to process through what happened and put those pieces back. But it means that you're no longer blaming that person for those missing pieces, perhaps. So you can still process the events and the emotions, even if you have forgiven the person. So like I said, there's a difference between forgiving the person and processing and moving on from the event. The next one is forgiveness means that the offending person is no longer indebted to you. And I think this is a big piece of the understanding of forgiveness. And if you don't have this can be really debilitating, because when you do not forgive the person, you're not able to move on from the event, because every time you're just going back to that person and your hatred towards that person and all those negative raw emotions that once you forgive them, it's like this release of I'm not indebted to them anymore. So I think back on my life and the different times that I have messed up, and how in those moments, there's things that I have done that I wish I could take back. I'm sure there's things you have done that you wish could have taken back. And what if somebody did not forgive you for those? Or what if Jesus did not forgive us for those? And so I like to use this in my own journey, because I think about the people that have hurt me and wronged me. And I think about, man, sometimes it would be easy to just hate them and to just not forgive them, because let's face it, people have deeply, deeply hurt us and deeply wronged us. But would I want Jesus to have done that to me when I messed up or I made mistakes? And I always come back to, no, I would not. I would not want my Heavenly Father to not forgive me for the things that I have done. And so this, in a way, provides me the freedom to think about other people, not how I relate to forgiving other people. So I kind of relate that to how I would want to be forgiven. And then forgiveness also means that you are more interested in moving ahead with your life than being controlled by the past. So your past can be so big and so painful, but if you don't have that forgiveness, then it is going to still feel big and painful. Even if you go through therapy and process the events and process what happened, if you don't have that true forgiveness, it is still going to seem so big and powerful that it's going to be really hard to work through those emotions if you don't have that piece of forgiveness. And again, when I work with people that aren't Christian, this concept of forgiveness is even more difficult to comprehend than people who are Christians. But it's very discouraging to work with people who don't think that they need to forgive. I mean, if you look at the court system. They tell you, you don't need to forgive this person. You don't need to. You were wronged. You don't need to forgive this person. So people come into my office and they're like, forgiveness? Why in the world would I do that after what this person did to me? And if they don't have any faith, it is really hard to get through to them this idea of forgiveness, and that really does hinder the progress that they make. I'm not just saying that. I have actually seen, I've worked with a lot of people who are not Christians. I've worked with a mix of people that are Christians and non-Christians, and I see so much more progress with people who have chosen to forgive than those who are not Christian and have absolutely no intention of ever forgiving. So forgiveness helps take that control away. It helps release the pain of the past. I don't care how old you are. You can be 85 years old and you can still forgive and release those chains. And you can see a lightness in yourself. You have that freedom to not let the past control you. There may be points in your life where you feel like you have forgiven the person and then the person does something else and then you're like, oh man, now I have to forgive them all over again. And that's okay. That's part of the process. Forgiveness is a process. And it likely, if you are still in contact with somebody from your dysfunctional family, you will have to keep forgiving them. It will not be, I forgave my mom for this. I have to forgive my mom every single time I see her because she does another thing to annoy me or be rude to me. And that is part of the process. So just because you forgive somebody one time does not mean, okay, that's it. Check. I've forgiven them. It's a continuous process of you may have to continue to forgive them. You may have to continue to forgive them even if they're not in your life and you have those triggers that come up. And you may have to say, I really thought I had forgiven them. And maybe you have, absolutely. But then these triggers come up and you kind of have to work through that process of forgiveness again. And that's where God, safe people, and therapy can be very helpful. All right, so I want to just read through this parable with you guys. It starts in Matthew 18, verse 21. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servants fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. I like this parable because in it, this guy is being such a hypocrite, right? He is asking and begging for forgiveness, but then he doesn't show that same forgiveness to the person that wronged him. So I want you to think about for a minute or two how you can apply this parable to your life, because God put these parables in the Bible for a reason, not just for stories for us to hear, but for us to be able to learn from them and apply them to our lives. So I want you to think about your own journey of forgiveness and how, I'm not going to make you answer, so don't worry, I'm not going to make you say it out loud, but I just want you to think about how you can apply this parable to your life. And then on the screen, we're not going to go over all these scripture verses on forgiveness, but we wanted to give you a reference and encourage you to look into each of these further for yourself.